Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 33. The topic is Ideas about Change over Time. Discussing agenda for the topic is Ideas about Change over Time. Lamarck's hypothesis of evolution. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about various ideas about evolution. Introduction. Darwin and other scientists studied fossils. Fossils are the remains or traces of organisms from the past that are usually found embedded in the rocks. Many fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. Rocks are of three major types: igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, and sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks are the major reservoirs of the fossils, and because these rocks are formed in layers, so they usually have rocks from different time periods, from different eras. Sedimentary rocks are formed from the sand and mud that settle to the bottom of seas, lakes, and swamps. Swamps are water-lodged areas. New layers of sediments cover older ones and compress them into superimposed layers of rocks called strata. For example, this is the lowermost layer, so this is the oldest one, and this is closer to the surface of the land, so this will be the most recent one. This is the most recent one, this is the oldest one, and the order is this, the order: most recent one, and this one second, third, fourth, fifth. This is the oldest one. The fossils in a particular stratum provides a glimpse of some of the organisms that populated Earth at the time that layer formed. Because the living organisms survive on Earth and then they die, they are buried in the ocean or the land, and then their bodies are covered with sand and mud, and it becomes a particular stratum, a particular layer, and thereafter this process is repeated for another layer and yet another layer. So if you dig deep into the earth or into a rocks, you will find different stratum, different layers, and each layer will have its characteristic fossil reserve, which will be an evidence of the organisms which used to live at the time when this particular strata was under formation. And carbon dating is usually used to find the time or the age of the stratum and the age of the fossils, so we can assume that those organisms used to live 100 or 200 or 300 million years ago. And similarly, we can study the organisms or the fossils from each stratum, and then we can analyze them for any similarities or differences, and then the evolutionary relationship between them can be drawn. Later erosion may carve through upper younger strata, revealing deeper older strata that had been buried. So paleontology is the study of fossils. A person who studies fossils is called a paleontologist, and this field was developed in large part by French scientist Georges Cuvier. In examining strata near Paris, a city of France, Cuvier noted that the older the stratum, the more dissimilar its fossils were to current life forms. Older the stratum means a stratum will be older, means it would have been laid much older than the one which has fossils that are looking more similar to the animals that are living nowadays. We just go back to that diagram. Just see here, this is the land surface. So the organisms which are living there, which are in existence, these organisms will be more similar to the organisms, to the fossils that are found in these strata as compared to the fossils which are found in these older strata. He also observed that from one layer to the next, some new species appeared while others disappeared. Just like we mentioned earlier that each strata had their characteristic group of fossils. He inferred that extinction must have been a common occurrence, but he strongly opposed the idea of evolution. Now, don't relate these differences in the animals or the fossils in different strata to evolution. He didn't related this difference to evolution. What was his point? Cuvier speculated that each boundary between strata represented a sudden catastrophic event, such as a flood that had destroyed many of the species living in that era. So George Cuvier was of the opinion that the organisms lived in a particular area at a particular time, and then suddenly some kind of a catastrophe arrived, and that catastrophe killed all animals, and these animals, their bodies were embedded in the sediments in the strata, and then this area was occupied by other animals migrating from other areas, and then after some time the same process repeated again. So he thought that the differences in the fossils found in the different strata is because of these catastrophic events, not because of the process of evolution. So he attributed the differences in the different strata, the differences in the fossils found in different strata, to these catastrophic events and not to evolution. Remember. Such reasons, he reasoned, were later repopulated by different species immigrating from other areas. In contrast to Cuvier's emphasis on sudden events, other scientists suggested that profound change could take place through the cumulative effect of slow but continuous processes. Other researchers were of the opinion that changes do occur, but those changes are slowly and gradually accumulated over a long passage of time instead of such catastrophic events. James Hutton proposed that Earth's geologic features could be explained by gradual mechanism. So he proposed the theory of gradualism, means the changes in the geography takes place slowly and gradually. The formation of the valleys is because of the rivers. The rivers keeps on flowing in a particular area, and these rivers keep on eroding the earth. As a result, deep engravings are created by these rivers, and the two sides are completely differentiated. As a result, the flora and the fauna of the two areas also tends to become different from each other. One of the examples of this process is the formation of the Great Canyon in America. You can see here, this is the Colorado River, and this Colorado River is flowing here for hundreds of thousands of years, and as the river flows through the earth's surface, it tends to erode the part of the earth, and as a result the river goes deeper and deeper. So here the river has completely divided those two portions of the earth from each other, and this valley has formed. So this is not as a result of a sudden catastrophic event, but it is because of a slow and gradual process. And so much difference has occurred here that it is also one of the examples for allopatric speciation. The species that are found in these two regions are also different from each other. The leading geologist of Darwin's time, Charles Lyell, incorporated Hutton's thinking into his proposal. Lyell said that the same geologic processes are operating today as in past, and at the same rate. So Hutton proposed his concepts, and he explained the prehistoric events with his ideas, with his theory, and Charles Lyell used some of his explanations and incorporated them into his own theory, and he said that whatever James Hutton predicted is also happening even nowadays. Such changes are also going on at a slow and gradual pace. Hutton and Lyell's ideas strongly influenced Darwin's thinking. How they influenced Darwin's thinking? Because Darwin was also in the beginning of the opinion that the species are unchanging, the species are fixed. He himself didn't believe in evolution in the beginning. He also thought that the earth is only 6,000 years old. He also believed in the biblical teachings that the species are fixed. But after the findings of these two scientists, after the research of these two scientists, he thought that if these such processes do takes place at slow and gradual rate, then the earth cannot be 6,000 years old. It must be a lot much older than 6,000 years old, because such processes takes lots of time. Such changes takes lots of time. Darwin agreed that if geologic change results from slow continuous actions, rather than from sudden events, then Earth must be much older than the widely accepted age of a few thousand years. It would be, for example, take a very long time for a river to carve a canyon by erosion. Means a river is flowing through a particular area, so it will take that river a lot of time to go there deep into that area, so that the two sides looks completely separated from one another. He later reasoned that perhaps similarly slow and subtle processes could produce substantial biological changes. So now he started applying that analogy to the living world, that maybe the living world is also under the effect of such forces which tends to change the species and the organism slowly and gradually. However, Darwin was not the first to apply the idea of gradual change to biological evolution. Means he was not the first person who thought that the living organisms could change with the passage of time. There is another person to whom we can attribute this. Lamarck's hypothesis of evolution. Although some 18th century naturalists suggested that life evolves as environment change, only one proposed a mechanism for how life changes over times. So there were other researchers in 18th century who talked about change, that yes, the life changes with the passage of time as the environment changes, but only Lamarck was the person who talked about the process of that change, that how this life changes, what is the mechanism through which this change takes place. And the mechanism which he talked about was the use and disuse of structures. Lamarck published his hypothesis in 1809, the year Darwin was born. Just imagine. By comparing living species with fossil forms, Lamarck had found that what appeared to be several lines of descent, each a chronological series of older to younger fossils leading to a living species. So Lamarck studied the existent species which were there at his time, and the fossil forms which were available, and he arranged the fossil forms on the basis of similarities, and he found different lines which lead to the species that were in existence today. For example, some of the fossils they met with one particular line of the species that were in existence, for example the fishes, whereas the other group of fossils, when arranged in chronological order, had more similarities with birds, yet another group of fossils, when arranged in chronological order, chronological means time-wise from older to younger, had more similarities with mammals. he explained his findings using two principles that were widely accepted at the time. The first was use and disuse, the idea that parts of the body that are used extensively become larger and stronger, while those that are not used deteriorate. So he talked about the use and disuse of structures. He said that in an organism, those structures which are frequently used, they increase in size. These structures become stronger, whereas those structures which are not used, they regress, they shrink, they decrease in size, and eventually they disappear. Among many examples, he cited a giraffe stretching his neck to reach leaves on high branches. So he gave an example that the giraffe used to have small necks because they had the leaves available at closer proximity to them, but when the leaves were not available at closer proximity, then they had to stretch their necks to pick leaves from the branches which were a bit higher, and because of that extension and stretching to find the leaves from the upper branches of the trees, the extension and the lengthening of their necks took place. The second principle is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He stated that an organism could pass these modifications to his offspring. So this was his second principle. He said that whatever change takes place in an organism is transferred to his offsprings, to the offsprings of that organism. Lamarck reasoned that the long muscular neck of the living giraffe had evolved over many generations as giraffes stretched their necks even higher. So Lamarck also thought that evolution happens because organisms have an innate drive to become more complex. Innate drive means we in biology usually use this word innate in behavior when we talk about innate behaviors or learned behaviors. So innate means something by birth, any characteristic which comes with that individual by birth. So we cannot use the word genes here to explain that term because there was no concept of genes at that time. So Lamarck thought that by birth some of the organisms have this desire to become more complex, to change. Now Darwin rejected his idea, but he too thought that variation was introduced into the evolutionary process in part through inheritance of acquired characteristics. Darwin rejected his ideas, but the variations are transferred from generation to generation. So Darwin accepted Lamarck's opinion in this regard. Today, however, our understanding of genetics refutes this mechanism. Experiments show that traits acquired by use during an individual's life are not inherited in the way proposed by Lamarck. So now we have knowledge of the DNA, we have knowledge of the genes, we have knowledge of how variations occur, we have knowledge of the sexual reproduction, the random fertilization, the gamete formation, the meiosis, the crossing over. So we know how variations are introduced into the offsprings. So now we can easily reject the hypothesis or the principle set by Lamarck at that time, the inheritance of the acquired characteristics. But if you look at in our broader picture, it is the parents which transfer these variations to the offsprings. The two parents, they combine, their gametes combine, and courtesy of this combination, the diploid organism takes these haploid set of gametes from both parents, and as a result this sexual reproduction provides variation to the offspring. Lamarck was strongly criticized, humiliated by Cuvier, and Cuvier also denied the evolution in species. So he strongly denied, he strongly condemned or humiliated or criticized Lamarck's ideas about evolution. Now, Lamarck faced criticism for his findings, and unfortunately we now remember Lamarck for presenting his false or wrong concepts or ideas about evolution. Lamarck is primarily remembered today not for his visionary recognition that evolutionary change explain patterns in fossils and the match of organisms to their environment, but for the incorrect mechanism he proposed. He talked about evolution, that evolution do takes place, but the mechanism which he proposed was not right. So nowadays the people does not give him credit for realizing, for presenting the fact that evolution do takes place, but they criticize him for the fact that he presented or gave a wrong mechanism of evolution. So I think it's a bit harsh on him. So now this is the timeline of evolution, or the work of various researchers. The first one is Charles Hutton, who in 1795 presented the theory of gradualism. According to James Hutton, slow continuous process occurs which are responsible for profound changes to the earth and not catastrophic events. The second is Lamarck. We just studied his work. He was the first person who proposed a mechanism for evolution, the use and disuse of structures and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He presented his theory in 1809, the same year where Darwin was born. In 1812, Cuvier speculated that each boundary between strata represented a sudden catastrophic event, such as a flood that had destroyed many of the species living in that area. So Cuvier talked about fossils. He is famous for his contributions in the field of paleontology. He studied fossils in different strata, but he didn't believe in evolution. He attributed the differences in the fossils in different strata to the fact that when the animals in a particular area were destroyed by a certain catastrophic event, their remains were embedded in a particular strata, and then this area was occupied by animals migrating from other area, and then this process was repeated again. So the differences in the animals found in different strata is not because of the process of evolution, but because of the catastrophic events. Lyell publishes his principle of geology, which says that the changes which Hutton talked about are taking place even nowadays. The slow and steady changes which are changing the geography of the earth are taking place even nowadays. And then in 1844, Darwin writes his essay on descent with modification. 1858, he publishes his work, and then in 1858, while studying species in the Malay archipelago, Wallace sends Darwin his hypothesis of natural selection. So it was one of the mistakes committed by Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace also reported somewhat similar findings as Darwin, but Darwin didn't had any idea about the mechanism which is responsible for the change. It was this person, Alfred Wallace, who found the mechanism for the change, and he wrote a paper, and then he sent that paper to Darwin for a review, and Darwin was waiting for that opportunity, and he studied that paper, he took idea from that paper, and then he wanted to publish his paper as early as possible, probably earlier than Wallace's paper, to get the credit. So the acquired characteristics cannot be inherited, means this tree is cut and it becomes smaller, and when the seeds of this tree are yielded, the seeds does not show the smaller phenotype, but they show the normal phenotype. So it means that the inheritance of the acquired traits was a false interpretation by Lamarck. This is the end of this lecture. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.